"Please, don't touch me," she begged, her back pressed hard against the rough wooden wall of the storeroom, both hands raised between herself and the cowboy standing in the doorway. "I mean it. Don't you dare." Wade Hennessy stood perfectly still in the frame of that doorway, hands at his sides, not moving an inch closer, studying the woman in front of him with an expression that held no confusion and no offense, just a careful, measured stillness that somehow made the moment more charged rather than less. He'd heard those words before in different rooms from different women, and he'd always done exactly what he was doing now. Nothing. He simply looked at her, then looked at his own hands hanging empty at his sides, and said quietly, "I wasn't going to." Rose Callahan didn't lower her hands. Not yet. 8 months of widowhood had given her back a great many things: her sleep, her appetite, the ability to walk through her own saloon without flinching at the sound of footsteps behind her, but it hadn't yet given her back the ability to trust a man's word when he said he meant no harm. Doyle Callahan had said he meant no harm approximately 400 times across 3 years of marriage, and she had the faded, poorly healed evidence of every single one of those promises written somewhere on her body. "Then step back," she said, "out of the doorway." He stepped back, just like that, without argument or wounded pride or the particular brand of male irritation she'd learned to read as the warning sign before everything got worse. He simply moved, creating space between them, and Rose breathed for the first time in what felt like a full minute. This was how Copperidge met Wade Hennessy. Not with gunfire or dramatic entrance, not with the swagger most men brought into Nevada mining towns like a second coat they put on at the territorial border. He'd ridden in 3 days ago on a dun-colored horse that looked as road-worn as its rider, tied up outside the general store, bought provisions without unnecessary conversation, and taken a room at the boarding house run by old Cecilia Marsh, without asking whether it was the best establishment in town or the only one. He ate his meals quietly, asked no questions about the copper mines, and spent his evenings reading at a corner table in the ember glass with a single glass of something he barely touched. Rose had noticed him, of course. She noticed every man who came through her doors, not from interest, but from the kind of trained vigilance that years of unpredictable danger installs in a person like a second nervous system. She cataloged them: drunk or sober, loud or quiet, the kind who looked at her like a woman or the kind who looked at her like a resource. Wade Hennessy was harder to catalog than most, which made him, paradoxically, the one she watched most carefully. He was broad across the shoulders and moved with an economy of motion that suggested either great physical confidence or great physical discipline. She hadn't yet determined which. His face was weathered but not old, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and eyes the color of creek water in early morning, a kind of shifting gray-green that changed depending on what light hit them. He wore no visible sidearm, which in Copperidge in 1887 was either the mark of a fool or the mark of a man confident enough in himself not to need the advertisement. The storeroom incident happened on the third day, when Rose had gone to inventory the back shelves before the evening crowd arrived, and found him already there, not lurking, not hiding, but crouched beside a section of the floor near the east wall, running his hand along the baseboards in a way that made absolutely no sense in the context of a man who was supposed to be a passing traveler with no particular interest in her property. When she demanded to know what he was doing, he'd stood up too quickly in the confined space, and the combination of the suddenness and the enclosed room and the particular way his large frame filled the doorway had done something to Rose's nervous system that she neither controlled nor apologized for. The hands came up, the words came out, and then the careful stillness that she still wasn't sure what to do with. "Why were you touching my floor?" she asked now, from the slightly safer distance of the hallway beyond the storeroom doorway. He considered the question longer than it seemed to require. "Checking the foundation," he said finally. "There's a section near the east wall that sounds hollow when you walk across it. Could be settling, could be something else." Something else meaning what? He looked at her steadily. I don't know yet. It was the most honest non-answer she'd ever received, and she found herself not knowing what to do with that either. She crossed her arms and studied him in the hallway light, the late afternoon Nevada sun cutting through the single window at the corridor's end and illuminating the dust motes between them. You've been in my saloon 3 evenings in a row, she said. You've barely touched your drink any of those evenings. You're not here for the whiskey, and you're clearly not here for conversation. So what exactly are you here for, Mr. Hennessy? The quiet, he said, and something in the uncomplicated simplicity of it made her believe him even as the rest of her trained, careful mind filed the hollow floor and the careful hands away for later examination. Copperidge was not a town that offered much quiet, which was perhaps why a man seeking it stood out so clearly against the backdrop of its usual noise. The copper mines 3 miles northeast had drawn enough men, and enough money to build the town up from nothing in 15 years, and enough violence and corruption to keep it from ever becoming what the promotional pamphlets the mining company distributed in Sacramento described it as. The streets were mud in winter and dust in summer. The buildings were functional rather than beautiful, and the single organizing principle of local governance was Deputy Sterling Prout, who was the law in Copperidge in the way that a fist is the law in a dark alleyway, present, forceful, and entirely unconcerned with justice. Sterling Prout was 43 years old, built like a man who'd been powerful once, and had let it soften without quite losing the threat underneath, with a thick mustache and small pale eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything in his environment with the restless attention of someone perpetually calculating advantage. He wore his deputy's star like it was something he'd won rather than been given, and he moved through town with a proprietary ease that made clear he considered Copperidge less a community to serve and more a resource to manage. He'd had his eye on the Ember Glass for 2 years, and his eye on Rose for slightly longer than that, though the two interests were not entirely separate in his mind. When Doyle Callahan had died 8 months ago, a fall from his horse on a road he'd ridden 1,000 times, the inquest had found an unfortunate accident. Sterling had given Rose what he considered an appropriately respectful 6 weeks before beginning to make his attentions known. Rose had made her position on those attentions known with a clarity that had surprised him, and the surprise had curdled slowly into something that wore the face of patience, but had the engine of something darker underneath. He came into the Ember Glass on the 4th evening of Wade Hennessy's quiet corner residency, and Rose watched his eyes find the stranger immediately with the reflexive territorial instinct of a man who considered every unfamiliar male in his town a potential displacement. Sterling bellied up to the bar and ordered without looking at Rose, his attention still on Wade across the room. "Who's the quiet one?" "Passing through," Rose said, which was what she said about everyone she wanted Sterling to lose interest in. "Passing through to where?" "Didn't ask." Sterling's pale eyes moved to her then, slow and assessing. "You should ask," he said. "Town like this, you can't afford to be casual about strangers." "I'll take that under advisement," Rose said, in the tone she'd perfected over 8 months, not quite flat enough to be openly hostile, not warm enough to be encouraging, walking the narrow line between the two with the precision of long practice. Sterling drank his whiskey and watched Wade Hennessy read his book for 10 minutes before his patience ran its natural, abbreviated course, and he crossed the room. Rose positioned herself closer to the bar's end without appearing to move with purpose, close enough to hear, close enough to intervene if the particular temperature of things required it. She couldn't hear what Sterling said first, something low. The kind of opening that establishes authority rather than initiates conversation. She heard Wade's response, though, because he didn't modulate his volume or his tone with any apparent awareness that he was supposed to be intimidated. "Just resting," he said. "Long ride. Good whiskey." "Where'd you ride from?" "Carson City, most recently." Most recently, Sterling repeated, tasting the qualifier. And before that. Around, Wade said and turned a page. The temperature in that corner of the room dropped several degrees in the way that only happens when a man of Sterling Pruitt's particular psychology encounters someone who genuinely doesn't recognize the authority being projected at them. Rose watched Sterling's jaw tight and knew the next 30 seconds required careful management. She brought a bottle to the table, an unnecessary refill, transparently an excuse, and set it down between them. "On the house," she said to Wade, then to Sterling with the precise calibration of someone diffusing something without acknowledging it needs diffusing. "Sterling, Hector was asking after you earlier. Something about the mine road." It worked because it was designed to work, not because Sterling was fooled. He gave Wade one more look that carried a clear promise of continued conversation, then moved toward the door, and Rose stood at the table a moment longer than necessary, not quite looking at Wade. "You could be a little less interesting to him," she said quietly. "I could," Wade agreed. "Probably won't help, though." She looked at him then directly for the first time. "Why not?" He closed his book and met her eyes with the gray-green steadiness she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things, without performance, without agenda, just looking. "Because it's not me he's interested in," Wade said. "I'm just new. He'll lose interest in new. What he won't lose interest in is this building." Rose went very still. "What do you know about this building?" He picked up his barely touched glass. "Not enough yet," he said, "but I'm working on it." She should have pushed harder right then, demanded the specifics, insisted on whatever he was working toward, refused to accept the measured non-disclosure of a man who clearly knew more than he was presenting. Later, she would identify that moment as the first of several points in the next 72 hours where the course of everything might have been altered if she'd simply asked the right question. But the saloon was filling with the evening crowd, and Sterling was still technically within earshot near the door, and something about the way Wade Hennessy looked at her, not like a resource, not like a woman he was calculating the value of, but simply like a person he was telling the truth to, made her pull back from the demand, and accept for one more evening the partial answer. It was the fourth evening that everything cracked open. Sterling came back after midnight, after the crowd had thinned and Rose was tallying receipts behind the bar with her bookkeeper's concentration, the one task that still managed to absorb her completely enough to quiet everything else. He came in with two men she recognized as working for the mine administration, not miners themselves, but the particular category of man who handled the mine administration's less official business. And the quality of his entrance was different from his earlier visit in a way that Rose's nervous system registered before her conscious mind caught up. He had paper in his hand. That was the first thing. Sterling Pruitt bringing paper anywhere was not a good sign. She set down her pen and waited. He laid the document on the bar between them with the satisfied deliberateness of someone who's been waiting for this moment long enough to have rehearsed it. "Property assessment," he said. "Town's been engaged by a land management firm out of Carson City to evaluate holdings in the Copperidge district. Turns out there are some questions about the title on this particular property that need addressing." Rose didn't touch the paper. "My title is clean," she said. "Has been since Doyle died, everything transferred to me directly." "That's what makes it interesting," Sterling said, and smiled the smile that she'd learned meant he believed he'd already won. "What transferred to you directly was the operating license and the building. The land underneath it is a separate matter, separate deed, and it seems like there might be some prior claims that weren't properly resolved before your husband's unfortunate accident." The door opened behind Sterling's men before Rose could respond, and Wade Hennessy walked in from whatever the Nevada night had been doing with him, coat dusty, expression unchanged from its perpetual careful neutrality, and stopped when he read the room. Sterling turned slowly. "Just the man," he said, and the warmth in it was entirely manufactured. I've been meaning to do some checking on our quiet visitor. Sent a wire to Carson City this afternoon. He reached into his coat and produced a second paper, a printed circular, the kind that moved between sheriff's offices across the territory. Funny thing, there's a man matching your description wanted for fraud and land misrepresentation in 3 counties. Goes by different names. I'd like to know which one's yours. The room held its breath. The 2 administration men shifted their weight. Rose looked at Wade and found him looking back at her, not at Sterling, not at the circular, but at her, with an expression she couldn't immediately interpret. Then she heard herself speaking before the decision to speak had fully formed. "This man has been in my establishment 4 consecutive evenings," she said, her voice carrying with the particular authority that 3 years of survival and 8 months of rebuilding had installed in it. "I know who he is. He's under no misrepresentation here." Sterling's pale eyes moved to her slowly. "You vouching for him, Rose?" "I'm stating a fact," she said, "which is more than I can say for that circular." The standoff held for 10 seconds that felt considerably longer, and then Sterling folded the circular back into his coat with the deliberate patience of a man making clear this was a delay rather than a conclusion. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he said to Rose, "about the land assessment." He looked once more at Wade. "And we'll talk about you." They left, and the saloon's remaining patrons slowly reanimated from the frozen attention they'd given the scene, returning to their conversations with the studied casualness of people pretending they hadn't been listening to every word. Rose turned to find Wade already at the bar, and she kept her voice very low. "You want to tell me what that circular is actually about?" "Yes," he said, "I do." He reached for his saddlebag, which he'd been carrying in from his horse, she realized, which was why he'd come back through the door, and set it on the bar between them. The buckle caught on the edge and the flap fell open, and when the bag tipped sideways, several items slid out across the bar's surface in a small cascade of personal effects and documents. Rose stopped one of the documents from sliding off the edge, looked down at what she was holding, and the blood left her face in a single, complete withdrawal that started at her hairline and finished somewhere around her knees. It was a photograph, mounted on cardstock, the kind made in proper studios with painted backdrops. 2 men standing in front of a building she didn't recognize, both looking at the camera with the formal stiffness of people unaccustomed to being photographed. One of the men was younger, leaner, without the road weathering she'd come to know in 4 days, but the gray-green eyes and the particular set of the jaw were unmistakable. The other man was her dead husband. Rose didn't put the photograph down. She stood behind her own bar in her own saloon with the card stock trembling between her fingers, and looked at the image of her dead husband standing beside a man she'd known for 4 days. A man whose name she still wasn't entirely certain was real, and felt the particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the ground shifting underneath a life you thought you'd finally stabilized. "Explain this," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the one reliable thing her body still did for her when everything else threatened to come apart. It kept her voice level, kept the surface calm while whatever was happening underneath happened out of sight. 3 years of marriage to Doyle Callahan had trained that into her as thoroughly as anything she'd ever learned. Wade looked at the photograph for a moment, then at her, and didn't reach for it. "I will," he said, "everything, but not here." "Here," Rose said, "now. This is my establishment, and that is my dead husband in your photograph. And you will explain it to me right now, or I will go get Sterling Prute back and hand you to him myself." It was an empty threat, and she suspected he knew it. She just publicly vouched for him in front of a deputy who was already looking for reasons to move against her, and revering that position would cost her more than it cost him. But something in the absoluteness of her tone, the complete absence of give in it, made Wade settle onto the bar stool across from her and fold his hands on the bar in a way that kept them visible and still and unthreatening. "My name is Wade Hennessy," he said. "That part is real. 18 months ago, I was working for a land acquisition firm based in Carson City, Meridian Holdings. They call themselves, though they've operated under 4 different names in the last decade, depending on which territory they're working in and how much heat they've accumulated. They hire men like me to go ahead of their legal teams into towns with mineral potential, assess the properties, identify which holdings sit above the valuable ground, and report back so they can begin acquiring titles before the owners understand what they're sitting on. Rose listened without moving. The saloon's ambient noise, the low conversation of the last few remaining patrons, the creak of the building in the night wind, seemed to come from a long distance away. Copperidge was on my assessment list, Wade continued. I came through 14 months ago, before you knew me, before you'd ever seen my face. I spent 2 weeks here, kept myself unremarkable, did my work. The secondary copper vein under this property, the one that's worth 4 times what the northeastern mines are producing. I found it in the Geological Survey records that Meridian had quietly acquired from the territorial office. This building sits directly above the primary access point. He paused. I put it in my report and I rode back to Carson City. And my husband, Rose said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except the need to get to the specific facts she needed. Was already in conversation with Meridian when I arrived, Wade said. I didn't know that until I got back. Doyle Callahan had approached them 6 months before I came to assess. He'd figured out something was under his land from the way the old prospectors talked about this particular plot, hadn't been able to prove it or extract it himself, and decided to sell the information and the rights to someone with the resources to do something with it. Sterling Prout was his introduction to Meridian. Sterling had been on their payroll for 2 years before any of this started. Rose set the photograph down on the bar between them because her hands had begun doing something she refused to let them do in front of a man she still didn't fully trust. She pressed both palms flat against the bar's surface and breathed through the information systematically, the way she'd taught herself to process things that wanted to overwhelm her, take it in pieces, understand each piece before moving to the next. Doyle sold the land rights, she said, without telling me. Signed the transfer 14 months ago, Wade said quietly, 3 months before he died. The particular quality of the silence that followed had weight to it. Sterling told Meridian that Doyle was becoming unreliable, Wade said, and his voice had changed slightly, flattened in a way she recognized as someone being careful with information they know is going to cause damage. That he was talking too much, reconsidering the arrangement, possibly thinking about telling you what he'd done. Meridian doesn't tolerate exposure. They communicated that to Sterling, and Sterling handled it, Rose said. Yes. She stood completely still for what felt like a very long time. The candles behind the bar guttered in a draft from somewhere, and the light shifted across the surface between them. And Rose Callahan stood in the middle of the life she'd rebuilt from the wreckage of a marriage she'd survived and understood, with perfect clarity and no comfort whatsoever, that her husband hadn't died in an accident on a road he'd ridden 1,000 times. He'd been murdered by the same man who'd spent the 8 months since his death circling her building with legal papers and patient eyes. She was not grieving Doyle Callahan. She had grieved him briefly, privately, the way you grieve something complicated, acknowledging the loss without pretending it was something it wasn't. What she felt now was colder and more specific than grief. It was the feeling of understanding the full shape of the trap she'd been living inside without knowing it was a trap at all. You went back to Carson City, she said, after your assessment, after you put it all in your report. And then what? And then I found out what Sterling did, Wade said. Not immediately, it took 3 months, pieces coming together from different directions. When I understood what had happened, I went to Meridian's principal office and I told them I wouldn't be part of it. That there's a difference between acquiring land from willing sellers and orchestrating a murder to clear the path to property. He looked at his hands on the bar, then back at her. They didn't take the distinction well. Fired me, kept my fee for the assessment, threatened to use the report I'd filed as evidence of my participation if I talked to anyone official. And then they told me to disappear and stay disappeared. But you came back, Rose said. I came back. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because you didn't know, he said. Because Sterling is still here, still on their payroll, still moving toward taking this building through whatever legal mechanism they can construct, and you're standing in the middle of it without the information you need to defend yourself. And I had that information and I rode away from it once already. He paused. I'm not built for riding away from things I should have stayed for. Rose looked at him across the bar for a long time. The last two patrons near the far wall gathered their coats and left with the quiet discretion of men who'd sensed the room was occupied with something beyond their presence. And then it was just the two of them in the thinning candlelight and the creak of the ember glass settling into the Nevada night. The hollow floor in my storeroom, she said. Access point to the secondary vein, he said. Whoever owns this building and this land when Meridian moves in will have direct access to the richest untapped copper deposit in the territory. That's what Sterling's legal paper tonight was the beginning of. They're not going to wait much longer. Rose reached beneath the bar for the document Sterling had left. She hadn't touched it after he'd walked out. Had left it lying on the wood as if contact with it might make whatever it represented more real. She read it now with the full attention of someone whose livelihood and survival and 8 months of painstaking rebuilding were written between its official lines. The land assessment claim, the suggestion of unresolved prior interests. The polite, legal language that meant, we are coming for what you're standing on. 48 hours, she said, reading the response deadline at the document's base. They want a response to the assessment claim within 48 hours. Which means they want you rattled and reactive rather than thinking clearly, Wade said. They want you to either challenge it through Sterling's own legal channels, which he controls, or panic and accept whatever settlement they offer, which will be designed to look generous and actually be worthless. What do I actually need? Rose asked. To fight this properly, what would actually work? The original contract, Wade said. The one Doyle signed. It'll be in Meridian's offices in Carson City. They don't use local attorneys for anything that's sensitive. They keep the originals in their own filing systems. If that contract can be examined by an independent legal authority, there's an argument that it was signed under duress, that Doyle was coerced or threatened into the arrangement, and therefore the transfer is legally invalid. It won't be easy to prove, but it's the legitimate path. Carson City is a day's hard ride, Rose said. Yes, he said, it is. She was already calculating the 48 hours, the distance, what could be done here while someone made that ride, what Sterling was likely to do next when he realized she wasn't going to fold quietly into whatever arrangement they'd prepared for her. Her mind moved through the logistics with the methodical efficiency she'd developed running a business alone, the same efficiency she'd applied to everything since Doyle died, and she'd discovered, with something approaching relief, that she was actually quite good at managing her own life when nobody was interfering with it. She was so absorbed in the calculation that she almost didn't notice Wade move. He'd shifted on the bar stool, not toward her, nothing sudden, nothing that invaded the careful distance she maintained around herself like a physical perimeter. But he'd turned slightly, and his right hand had moved from the bar to the space between them, palm up, open, not reaching but present. Offered. She noticed it the way you notice something that breaks the rules of the environment you've carefully constructed, immediately, completely, with the full attention of every system in her body that had learned over years to monitor exactly this kind of thing. She looked at his hand. Open palm, fingers relaxed, a scar along the base of the thumb from something old, calluses from rope and reins, completely still. Not grabbing, not taking, not the hand of a man who decided he was entitled to her, just a hand, extended, waiting. You don't have to, he said quietly, and the words were so simple and so completely free of pressure that they did something unexpected. They made the choice feel real, made it actually hers in a way that nobody had made anything hers in a very long time. Rose Callahan looked at that open hand for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate intention of someone making a conscious decision rather than a reflexive one, she lifted her right hand from the bar's surface and placed it in his. He didn't close his fingers around hers. Didn't grip, didn't pull, didn't do anything except remain exactly as still as he'd been when the hand was empty, so that the only change in the world was the warmth of contact, steady and quiet, like something solid in the middle of a floor that had been hollow. And Rose Callahan started shaking. Not the shaking of fear, not the flinching withdrawal her body had learned to produce at the approach of a man's hands, but something older and deeper and more fundamental, the shaking of a person who has been braced against impact for so long that the absence of impact is its own kind of shock. The shaking of a woman discovering, in a candle-lit saloon at midnight in a Nevada mining town, that being touched gently is a thing that exists in the world, that it had simply never found her until now. Neither of them spoke. The candles burned. The building creaked in the wind above the hollow floor and the fortune beneath it and the 48-hour clock that had already begun its count. Then the front door of the ember glass opened, and Sterling Pruitt walked back in. He wasn't alone this time. Behind him came 4 men Rose had never seen before, not local, not mine administration, but the particular category of man that travels with legal papers and does the kind of work that doesn't have an honest name. And in Sterling's hand was a new document, different from the one he'd left on the bar, with the specific dimensions of something that had been prepared well in advance of tonight. Change of timeline, Sterling said, his pale eyes moving from Rose's face to her hand and what it was resting in, and something shifting in his expression that was uglier than anything he'd shown her yet. The assessment response is now required immediately. Tonight. He set the new document on the bar with a finality that made the wood seem to accept it like a verdict. Sign over the land rights voluntarily, Rose, and you keep the building and the license. Refuse, and we exercise the prior claim, and you walk out of here with nothing. Rose didn't move her hand. She looked at Sterling across the bar with the level, calibrated expression she'd spent 3 years perfecting and 8 months reinforcing, and said nothing. Sterling's eyes dropped again to her hand in Wade's, and the ugliness in his expression deepened into something that had made harder women than Rose take a step backward. "I'd think very carefully," he said softly, "about whose hand you're holding." Rose didn't sign anything. That was the first decision, made in the space of a single breath while Sterling's 4 men arranged themselves between her and the saloon's exit with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this particular kind of work before. Not violent, not yet, but positioned in a way that made the geometry of the room say everything their silence didn't. She looked at the document on the bar, looked at Sterling's pale eyes above his thick mustache, and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't courage exactly, but was the thing that comes after you've survived enough to stop being surprised by the lengths people will go to when they want something you have. "No," she said. Sterling's expression didn't change. That was the thing about men like Sterling Pruitt. They didn't telegraph anger the way Doyle had, with the building pressure and the visible signs Rose had learned to read like weather. Sterling went still instead, which was its own kind of warning. "You're not understanding the situation, Rose." "I understand it completely," she said. "You had my husband murdered. You've been managing this acquisition from the inside for 2 years, and this document is the last step in a scheme that was designed before Doyle was even cold. What I won't do is make it easier for you by putting my name on your paperwork." The room held the particular quality of silence that precedes something irreversible. Wade hadn't moved from the bar stool. His hand, she realized, was no longer under hers. At some point in the last 30 seconds he'd shifted, and she couldn't immediately account for where his hands were now, which under any other circumstances would have activated every alarm system her body possessed. Instead she found, surprisingly, that the absence of his hand felt less like threat and more like him making room, clearing the space around her so that whatever she did next was entirely and unambiguously hers. "Take her upstairs," Sterling said to the men behind him. "She can think about the paperwork overnight." Wade moved then. Not toward the men, not with any kind of dramatic physical confrontation. He simply stood from the bar stool and placed himself between Rose and the two men who'd started toward her with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who'd taken the full measure of a situation and made a quiet decision about his role in it. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, occupying the space between her and them, and said to Sterling in the same level tone he used for everything, "That's not going to happen." Sterling looked at him with the flat assessment of a man calculating whether an obstacle is worth the energy of removing it. "You're one man," he said. "Without a weapon I can see, in a building I'm about to legally own, with 4 men behind me and a badge on my chest." "Badge doesn't mean much when Carson City gets wind of what's under this floor," Wade said. "Meridian's been operating under the assumption that nobody outside their organization knows about the secondary vein. That assumption has been wrong for approximately 4 days. The question you need to ask yourself, Sterling, is whether what happens in the next 5 minutes makes your situation better or considerably worse." It was a bluff built on a truth, which is the only kind of bluff that holds Meridian didn't know what Wade knew or didn't know about their exposure. And Sterling, for all his local confidence, was ultimately an instrument of an organization whose decisions were made in Carson City offices he'd never been invited into. Rose watched him calculate, watched the pale eyes move between Wade and the document on the bar and some internal accounting she couldn't fully read, and held her breath. "Tomorrow morning," Sterling said finally, putting his hat back on with the deliberate calm of a man deferring rather than retreating. 7 o'clock. I'll be back with the marshal and a court order instead of a request. Sign it tonight and keep the building. Wait for tomorrow and keep nothing." He looked at Rose one final time with the expression of a man who believes patience is just victory with a longer timeline. "Think carefully." They left. The door closed. Rose counted to 10 before she allowed her shoulders to drop from where they'd been hovering somewhere near her ears, and then she turned to find Wade already moving toward the bar's end with the purposeful efficiency of someone who understands that the departure of an immediate threat is not the same thing as safety. 7 o'clock, she said. "That's roughly 8 hours from now," he said. "Carson City is 7 hours hard riding, which means I leave in the next 20 minutes, get there at first light, find the Meridian offices, and get back here with the original contract, and whatever legal authority I can put on a horse before Sterling walks back through that door." He was checking his coat pockets as he spoke, the movements economical and without wasted motion. The contract under duress argument needs an independent legal mind, someone not connected to Sterling, not connected to Meridian, someone with territorial standing whose opinion a court would actually weigh. "There's a lawyer," Rose said, her mind pulling up the information with the speed of someone used to solving problems under pressure. "Came through 3 days ago, staying at Cecilia Marsh's boarding house, waiting on a mining dispute to be calendared in the copyridge proceeding. Name is Aldrich Beaumont. He's territorial bar certified. I saw his papers when he left them on the bar while he paid for his meal." Wade stopped moving. "He's still in town." "Was at supper tonight. Cecilia's full, nobody leaves before breakfast." Something shifted in Wade's expression, not quite relief, but the particular recalibration of a plan finding better footing than it had a moment before. "Then Beaumont is your first move," he said. "Tonight, before Sterling can get to him or around him. Wake him up if you have to. Lawyers who take cases that matter don't resent being woken for good reason. Tell him everything. Show him Sterling's assessment document and the photograph. Don't leave anything out." "And you," Rose said. "Carson City and back," he said. 7 hours out, give or take. I'll push the horse hard as I can justify." He picked up his saddlebag from the bar, then paused, the same pause she'd noticed earlier, the slight recalibration before speaking, the habit of a man who measured words before releasing them. "If I'm not back before Sterling arrives with the marshal." "Then I'll stall," Rose said. "I'm good at that." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I know you are," he said, and the simplicity of it, no qualification, no surprised inflection, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact, landed somewhere it hadn't been expected to land. She walked him to the back door that opened onto the alley where he'd apparently moved his horse during the evening without her noticing, and stood in the doorway while he checked the cinch and adjusted the saddlebag's placement with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent most of his life making quick departures. The Nevada night was cold and clear, stars dense and indifferent above the dark shapes of the buildings, the distant sound of the mines on the night shift a constant low percussion under everything. "Hennessy," she said, when he had one foot in the stirrup. He paused, looking at her over his shoulder. She'd been going to say something practical, "Be careful," or "Don't let the horse break down on the return leg," or something else that addressed the logistics rather than the thing underneath the logistics. Instead, what came out was, "You came back when you didn't have to." "Yes," he said. "I want you to know I understand what that cost you." He was quiet for a moment. "It cost me considerably less than it would have cost you if I hadn't," he said. Then he swung up into the saddle and moved into the alley's dark, and Rose stood in the back doorway of the ember glass and listened to the hoofbeats diminish until the night absorbed them entirely. Aldrich Beaumont did not resent being woken at 2 in the morning. He opened Cecilia Marsh's boarding house door in a flannel robe with his silver hair disheveled, and his reading glasses still on from the brief he'd apparently been reviewing at an hour that suggested either dedication or insomnia, took one look at Rose's expression and said, "Come in and tell me everything." She did. It took 40 minutes. The photograph spread on Cecilia's kitchen table alongside Sterling's assessment document, Beaumont asking precise and intelligent questions in the patient manner of a man who understands that the quality of his eventual opinion depends entirely on the quality of the information he receives. He made notes in a small leather book, asked her to repeat 3 specific details from Sterling's document, and then sat back with the expression of a man running calculations. "The duress argument is legitimate," he said. "If the original contract shows the timeline I think it will, the signing date relative to what your husband knew about Meridian's methods and what they were capable of, a territorial court would have serious grounds to void the transfer. The problem is that without the original document, we're arguing based on the copy Sterling's waving around, which is their version of events rather than the truth of them." "The original is in Carson City," Rose said. "Someone is writing for it right now." Beaumont looked at her over his reading glasses. "Someone you trust?" Rose considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Someone who came back when it would have been easier not to," she said. "Yes." Sterling arrived at 7:15, not 7, which told Rose something about his confidence level. Men certain of their position don't adjust their arrival times. He came with the town's territorial marshal on loan from the county seat, a heavy-set man named Carver who looked like he'd have preferred to be anywhere else on Earth, and was fulfilling his legal obligation with the minimal enthusiasm of someone who'd been told what to do without being told why. 4 of Sterling's men were behind them again, and Sterling carried the court order he'd promised with the comfortable authority of a man who'd had it prepared well in advance. Beaumont was already in the saloon when they arrived, seated at the bar with his territorial bar certification on the wood in front of him and his small leather notebook open beside it. He stood when Sterling entered, introduced himself with the crisp precision of a man whose credentials in this territory outranked Sterling's by a significant margin, and said, "I'm representing Mrs. Callahan in this matter. I'd like to review the court order, please." Sterling's entrance lost half its momentum in the space of 10 seconds. He looked at Beaumont, at the certification, at Rose behind the bar, and something in the pale eyes recalculated rapidly. "The order is straightforward," Sterling said, recovering. "Land rights seizure under prior claim. Prior claim that derives from a contract signed under documented duress," Beaumont said pleasantly, "by a man who was subsequently murdered to prevent his recantation of said contract. Yes, I'm familiar with the mechanism. The question before Marshal Carver this morning is whether he wants to execute an order built on that foundation before the original contract has been independently examined." He turned to Carver with the measured courtesy of a man who understood that giving an official a face-saving option is usually more effective than backing them into a corner. "Marshal, I'm not asking you to dismiss anything. I'm asking for a reasonable continuance pending review of the foundational document. 24 hours. Carver looked at the certification, looked at Sterling, and made the calculation of a man who'd been doing his job long enough to recognize when he was being asked to be someone else's instrument. "Where's the original contract?" he asked Sterling. Sterling's jaw tightened. "Carson City." "Then we wait for it," Carver said simply. 12 hours. If it's not here by this afternoon, we proceed." The door of the ember glass opened at 11:30, with a particular quality of urgency that Rose had learned, in a single night, to associate with one specific set of footsteps. Wade came through with dust from the hard ride still pale on his dark coat, a leather document case under his arm, and something in his expression that she read immediately as the controlled relief of a man who'd cut the timing far closer than he'd have preferred. Behind him, stepping through the door with the deliberate authority of someone who'd been briefed thoroughly on the ride back and understood exactly what room they were walking into, was a Carson City marshal named Delacroix, younger than Carver, sharply dressed, with the specific energy of a man who'd been building a case against Meridian Holdings for 18 months and had just been handed the piece he'd been missing. The original contract was on the bar in Beaumont's hands within 2 minutes. By noon, Delacroix had taken Sterling Prute into custody on charges that began with conspiracy and moved through fraud and into territory that included the word murder without flinching. Meridian's local operation collapsed the moment Sterling's network understood their central instrument was no longer available, and the 4 men who'd stood in the saloon the night before had apparently made the sensible decision to put considerable distance between themselves and Copperidge before daylight. Beaumont spent 2 hours with the original contract, Carver's continuance, and Delacroix's federal authority, and by mid-afternoon, Rose Callahan's ownership of the Ember Glass, the building, the license, the land beneath it, and the secondary copper vein that the land sat above, was legally confirmed, documented, and signed by 2 marshals and a territorial attorney in a saloon that felt, for the first time in longer than Rose could immediately calculate, like something she actually owned rather than something she was temporarily occupying between disasters. She found Wade outside in the late afternoon, leaning against the alley wall where he'd returned his horse to the hitching post, face tipped slightly upward toward the Nevada sun with the boneless exhaustion of a man who'd ridden 14 hours in a single push, and was now letting the relief of completion do whatever it needed to do to his body without interference. "You're staying," Rose said. It came out flatter than she intended, not a question, not quite a statement, somewhere in the uncertain territory between them. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Is that what you want?" She'd been thinking about the answer to that question since approximately 2 in the morning, while she was waiting in the saloon alone with the candles and the hollow floor and the 48-hour clock and the memory of her hand in his. The warmth of it, the steadiness, the completely unprecedented experience of contact that asked nothing and took nothing and simply offered itself and waited. "I've spent 3 years afraid of hands," she said, "and 8 months convinced I was better off without anyone's, and then you put yours out on a bar in the middle of everything falling apart and you didn't close it around mine. You just—" she stopped. "You just left it open." "That's the only way a hand should ever be offered," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, at the road dust, and the exhaustion and the gray-green eyes that looked at her the same way they always had, without agenda, without performance, simply and directly, as if she were a person worth the full attention of an honest gaze. "The floor in the storeroom needs fixing," she said, "and I need someone who knows what's down there to help me figure out what to do with it, and I'm not particularly good at asking for help." She paused. "But I'm learning." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Rose nodded once, with the decisive efficiency of a woman resolving something she'd been working toward for longer than she'd admitted. Then she turned back toward the door of the ember glass, her building, her land, her floor with its hollow beneath it and its fortune underneath that, and held the door open behind her without looking back, because she didn't need to look back. She could hear his footsteps following, steady and unhurried, exactly the right distance behind her, not crowding, not grabbing, not taking anything that hadn't been freely given. For the first time in 3 years, the sound of footsteps following her inside didn't make her flinch.